The doors sealed behind me with a sound like bone breaking under hydraulic pressure. I had entered the Sanctum Imperialis at the appointed hour, carrying nothing but my data slate and the catechisms I had memorized across 2 decades of service. The night's synchronization was not an honor, it was a function, assigned by rotation through the Mechanicus Sacristan Corps according to principles I had never questioned. My role was preservation through observation, maintenance through prayer, continuity through perfect repetition. I was Archivist Second Class Valancourt, and I believed this night would be like all the others described in the archives, holy, controlled, and survivable. The lumens dimmed according to ritual schedule, dropping through 7 stages of reduction until only the throne's own radiance remained. Gold light spilled across marble the color of old ivory, catching in the veins of machinery that threaded through stone like infection through flesh. The air tasted of ionization and incense, metallic and sacred in equal measure. My augmetic respiratory filter clicked softly as it adjusted to the sanctified atmosphere, compensating for trace elements that would have poisoned unmodified lungs within minutes. I began the first catechism at the prescribed mark, standing before the outermost reliquary station where conduits as thick as my torso descended into the floor. My voice felt small in the vastness, swallowed by architecture designed to dwarf human scale. The words were ancient, their meaning layered beneath pronunciations that had shifted across millennia until they resembled prayer more than technical instruction. By the Omnissiah's grace and the Emperor's endless suffering, I witness continuity. By his pain made light, I record stability. By his silence made law, I preserve function. The response should have come from the machine spirit chorus, a harmonic acknowledgement that registered on my slate as a specific frequency pattern. It came, but the timing was wrong by 0.3 seconds. Not much, barely measurable. Within tolerances, that doctrine would classify as acceptable variance. I adjusted my internal chronometer, assuming calibration drift. The night was young, my faith was absolute. I had prepared for this duty through years of lesser postings, working my way through the outer sancta of the imperial palace until I earned proximity to the throne itself. This was the apex of my calling. The closest a tech adept of my rank could approach the Emperor's physical form without divine sanction or martyrdom. The custodians stood in their positions around the chamber's perimeter, golden armor catching the throne's light in ways that made them seem less like men and more like ambulatory reliquaries. They did not speak. They had not spoken since I entered. I had been briefed that they would not speak unless the protocols demanded intervention, and the protocols had not changed in recorded history. Their silence was reassuring, proof that all proceeded according to design. I moved to the second station, following the prescribed path marked by tiles, fractionally darker than their surroundings. The route formed a spiral through the outer sancta, bringing me gradually closer to the throne itself over the course of the night's progression. Each station held its own catechism, its own series of observations to be recorded and verified. The work was meditative, demanding enough to occupy conscious thought while leaving deeper cognition free to bask in proximity to the God Emperor's presence. The heat increased as I walked. This was expected. The throne generated thermal output that defied purely mechanical explanation, warmth that felt purposeful rather than incidental. My augmetics compensated, rerouting blood flow and adjusting skin conductivity to maintain core temperature. The modifications had been performed specifically for this assignment, calculated to allow me to function within the throne room's unique environmental parameters. At the second station, I placed my palm against the access panel and felt it recognize my bioelectric signature. The panel opened with a hiss of escaping pressure, revealing rows of monitoring instruments that tracked the throne's secondary functions. Hundreds of needles traced their endless paths across parchment, recording data that would be archived and never read. The Emperor's suffering was too vast for comprehension, so we measured its edges and called that knowledge. I recited the second catechism, watching the needles as I spoke. They should have remained steady, varying only within established margins. Most did, one did not. A single needle, tracking a function whose label had been worn away by countless hands touching the brass plate beneath it, showed a spike that resolved itself before I could finish noting its magnitude. The machine spirit had corrected itself. This was proper function. Systems this ancient, this holy, maintained themselves according to principles beyond human understanding. I recorded nothing because there was nothing to record. The deviation had been consumed by its own resolution. My training was clear. Only sustained anomalies warranted documentation. Transient fluctuations were the throne breathing. The Emperor's pain finding new pathways through agony too vast for human comprehension. I closed the panel and moved to the third station. The spiral tightened. The heat increased another increment. My augmetic chrono indicator showed that 17 minutes had elapsed since sealing, which aligned with expected progression. The night would last exactly 8 hours and 43 minutes, timed to Terra's rotation and the moment when dawn's first light would touch the palace's eastern battlements. Until then, I existed in ritual darkness, performing duties that had been performed every night for 10,000 years. The third catechism focused on endurance, acknowledging the Emperor's eternal vigil. As I spoke, I became aware that the custodian positions had shifted, not moved, shifted. They stood in different places than they had moments before, though I had not seen them relocate. The geometry of their formation had changed from a protective perimeter to something tighter, more focused. The corridors between their positions had narrowed. This was not alarming. Custodians operated according to threat assessments and protective protocols I could not perceive. Their adjustments were preemptive, flawless, and required no explanation. If they had moved, there was reason. If I had not seen them move, my attention had been appropriately focused on my duties rather than on my protectors. Still, the walking path felt narrower now. The tiles that marked my route seemed to channel me more precisely, leaving less room for deviation. I adjusted my gait unconsciously, keeping to the exact center of the prescribed path. The heat pressed closer, no longer diffuse but directional, as if the throne's radiance had focused slightly, narrowing its cone of illumination. At the fourth station, the monitoring instruments showed nothing unusual. I spoke the catechism and felt the words settle into the chamber's acoustic profile like stones into water. The throne's harmonic, the constant, fundamental vibration that pervaded the entire sanctum had developed complexity I did not remember from my briefings. It still registered as a single tone on my auditory augmetics, but beneath that tone I perceived layers, rhythms nested within rhythms like a heartbeat fractured across multiple chambers. I logged this as subjective interpretation rather than measured fact. The human mind sought patterns even in perfection, generating meaning from data that required none. My perception was not instrumentation. My observations mattered only insofar as they confirmed what the machines already knew. The fifth station brought me close enough to see the throne itself with my unaugmented eyes. It rose at the chamber's center, a mountain of machinery and flesh, gold and agony given architectural form. I had seen images, studied diagrams, memorized the throne's configuration from every angle that servitors had been permitted to record. None of that prepared me for the physical reality of standing in its presence. The Emperor sat in suffering beyond description, his form barely visible within the mechanisms that sustained and imprisoned him. Tubes thicker than my body pierced flesh that glowed with borrowed life. Cables woven from materials that predated imperial classification wrapped around limbs held in configurations that suggested both crucifixion and enthronement. The Astronomican's light blazed from somewhere behind the throne, painting everything in shades of gold that made shadows seem like wounds in reality itself. I had been taught that to look directly at the Emperor was to invite madness or transcendence in equal measure. I kept my gaze on the instruments, on the duties that gave my presence purpose. The catechism for the fifth station was the longest, a litany of technical specifications and religious affirmations woven together until they became indistinguishable. I spoke each word with the precision my training demanded, feeling them resonate in the chamber's acoustic space. Halfway through the recitation, a vox chime sounded. The tone was correct, indicating an authorized transmission, but the timing was wrong. This blessing was scheduled for the night's 7th hour, not the 1st. I paused, waiting for the message. By the grace of the Omnissiah and the Emperor's endless mercy, we acknowledge the flesh that serves and the metal that endures. The voice was Magos Hieronymus Talix, dead for 2 centuries, but preserved in Vox recording as all senior Mechanicus adepts were. His blessing was familiar, part of the standard liturgical rotation. But the words he spoke next were not in any archive I had studied. Where function demands presence, let presence become function. Where proximity sanctifies, let sanctification consume. Where the throne requires adjustment, let the living become adjustment. The transmission ended. My data slate contained no record of receiving it, though my auditory augmetics confirmed I had not imagined the sound. I completed the catechism, noting nothing. The Vox systems were ancient beyond comprehension, maintained by protocols I could not access. If a blessing arrived outside schedule but with proper authentication, that was for higher authority to evaluate. My role was continuity, not investigation. The 6th station required me to physically interface with a subsystem monitoring cogitator, linking my own augmetics to the throne's peripheral awareness. This was always the night's most demanding moment, the point where my flesh and faith would be tested by proximity to something infinitely greater than myself. I had prepared through fasting and prayer, through neural conditioning and chemical purification. I was ready to serve as a conduit, to let my mind become briefly transparent to the machine spirit's requirements. I placed both palms on the interface nodes and felt the connection establish. Current flowed through my nervous system, carrying data in formats my organic brain could not process directly. My augmetics translated where they could, presenting streams of information that cascaded through my awareness like falling water. Most of it was meaningless to me, technical specifications far beyond my clearance or comprehension. I maintained the connection, serving as a bridge, allowing the throne's lesser systems to verify their own function through external witness. Pain arrived with precision. Not the diffuse ache of muscle strain or the sharp warning of injury, but something orchestrated, purposeful. It began in my left hand, traveling up the ulnar nerve in pulses timed to the throne's harmonic. The sensation was instructive, correcting my posture by minute degrees. I straightened my spine. The pain eased. I adjusted the angle of my wrists. The pain refined itself, guiding rather than punishing. This was proper function. The throne required specific configurations for interface, and my body was learning them through the most efficient possible instruction. Pain was information. Compliance brought relief. I accepted the lesson, feeling something in my chest unclench as I understood that even my suffering had purpose here, that I was being corrected because I was valuable enough to correct. The interface lasted 3 minutes and 47 seconds. When I withdrew, my hands bore no marks, but the memory of pain persisted in nerve pathways that had been rewritten to hold new certainty. I knew without conscious thought exactly how I would need to position myself at the next station, what angle would be required, what stance would prove acceptable. I moved forward. The heat had become environment rather than sensation, omnipresent and therefore ignorable. My augmetic temperature sensors registered levels that should have triggered alarm protocols, but the alarms remained silent. The throne room maintained its own rules, operated according to principles that superseded normal safety margins. I was where I was meant to be, doing what I was meant to do. At the 7th station, I noticed the scorch marks for the first time. They were subtle, layered into the floor tiles like geological strata. Each mark was roughly the size of boot soles, positioned precisely where someone standing at this station would place their feet. I looked more carefully and saw that the marks varied in depth and age, some freshly darkened, others worn almost smooth by time and traffic. They formed a palimpsest of presence, recording centuries of personnel standing exactly where I now stood. The realization settled into my awareness without urgency. Of course, there were marks. The throne's heat affected all materials over time. That others had stood here before me was not revelation, but confirmation. I was part of continuity, one link in an unbroken chain of service. The marks proved the system worked, that personnel could serve their full rotation and depart to other duties. Survival was standard. Completion was expected. I performed the catechism for the 7th station, watching my slate as it recorded atmospheric data and spiritual observations in columns that would be archived alongside 10,000 years of identical entries. The work was soothing in its redundancy, demanding enough to occupy my hands and voice, while leaving my deeper cognition free to exist in meditative presence. The custodians had drawn closer still. I could see them now without turning my head, golden figures standing at the edge of my peripheral vision. Their armor caught the throne's light in ways that made distance difficult to judge. They seemed both very near and impossibly far, existing in a space that obeyed different geometries than the rest of the chamber. None of them had moved. I was certain of this because I had been watching, maintaining awareness even while focused on my duties. Yet the formation had continued to tighten, the protective perimeter becoming something more like containment. The walking path forward to the 8th station passed between two custodians now, where before it had run through empty space. I walked forward. They did not acknowledge me. Their stillness was absolute, inhuman in its perfection. I passed between them and felt the heat intensify, focused like light through a lens. My path was a corridor of precisely calculated exposure, allowing me to proceed while ensuring I absorbed the exact amount of the throne's radiance my role required. The 8th station's instruments were identical to those at the 4th, but their readings had changed in ways I could not immediately categorize. The needles traced patterns that seemed regular until I tried to measure their rhythm, at which point they became irregular in ways that suggested deeper structure beyond my perception. I spoke the catechism and watched the patterns shift, responding to my words or my presence or some other variable I could not identify. 3 hours had passed, or 4. My chronometer showed consistent progression, but my internal sense of duration disagreed. The night felt both endless and compressed, stretching and contracting according to rules that had nothing to do with measured time. I checked my slate and saw that exactly 2 hours and 11 minutes had elapsed since sealing. The discrepancy was mine, not the machine's. Time perception was unreliable under stress, and this was stressful only in the most holy sense. At the 9th station, the required task changed. Instead of passive observation and recitation, I was instructed to perform a manual adjustment to one of the conduit relays. The instruction appeared on my slate without warning, formatted in the standard Mechanicus notation but lacking the usual authentication sigil. The adjustment was minor, rotating a valve through 7 degrees of arc to compensate for thermal expansion in the underlying systems. I hesitated. Manual adjustments were typically reserved for higher-ranked tech priests, those with augmetics sophisticated enough to interface directly with the throne's machine spirits. My modifications were extensive, but not that extensive. I was an observer, not an operator. The instruction repeated. This time, the authentication sigil appeared, bearing the mark of the Fabricator General himself. The order was valid. Questioning it was not. I approached the designated conduit and found the valve exactly where the schematic indicated. It was warm to the touch, radiating heat that spoke of massive energy transfer beneath the ceramic housing. The adjustment mechanism was simple, requiring only physical force rather than technical sophistication. I gripped the valve's handle and began to turn. Resistance met me immediately. The valve did not want to move, held in place by forces beyond normal friction. I applied more pressure, feeling my augmetic muscles engage, drawing on reserves of strength that normal flesh could not match. The valve shifted incrementally, grudging each degree of rotation. At the 3rd degree, something changed in the throne's harmonic. The fundamental vibration I had been hearing since entering the chamber gained a new overtone, higher and sharper, almost like a voice trying to form words. I continued turning. At the 5th degree, pain flared in my palms where they gripped the valve, not from heat but from something that felt like current, like the valve was conducting punishment for my presumption. I did not stop. The order had been given. Compliance was my only option. At the 7th degree, the valve locked into position with an audible click that resonated through the floor. The pain in my hands ceased. The new overtone in the throne's harmonic stabilized, integrating into the existing pattern. I stepped back and logged the adjustment as complete. My slate recorded the action with timestamp and authentication, creating permanent documentation that I had touched the throne's systems, that my hands had moved something connected to the Emperor's eternal suffering. The knowledge felt heavy, significant in ways I could not articulate. I had not just observed, I had participated. I had altered something, however minutely. The custodians had not reacted. This was proper. If the adjustment had been erroneous, they would have intervened before completion. Their continued stillness affirmed correctness, even as it provided no comfort. I moved to the 10th station and found it empty of instruments. Instead, there was only a standing position marked on the floor and a viewing port that looked directly toward the throne's lowest tier. I was meant to stand and witness, nothing more. The catechism for this station was short, almost conversational. I stand in your presence. I witness your suffering. I carry forward knowledge of your endurance. Simple words, but speaking them felt different than all the previous recitations. Standing here, facing the throne without the buffer of instrumentation or documentation, reduced me to essential function. I was meat given purpose through proximity. I was eyes to see what could not look upon itself. The throne's radiance intensified. I do not know if this was objective reality or perceptual shift, but the gold light became painful to perceive, bright enough that my augmetic optical filters engaged automatically. Even filtered, the light felt invasive, searching, as if it evaluated me and found my presence insufficient yet acceptable. Time dissolved. I stood at the 10th station for what felt like hours, though my chronometer later insisted only 14 minutes had passed. During that duration, I became aware of details I had not consciously registered before. The throne was not still. Despite its apparent permanence, it moved constantly in ways too small and too vast for easy perception. Mechanisms adjusted with glacial slowness. Flesh shifted beneath restraints that were also supports. The Emperor breathed, if breathing was the word for what happened when something that should not be alive continued to sustain existence through will and machinery in equal measure. I understood with sudden, awful clarity that the throne was not maintaining him. He was maintaining it, holding together systems that would collapse into dysfunction without his constant attention, his endless suffering translating into stability for mechanisms that had forgotten how to function independently. The revelation felt like vertigo, like standing on the edge of something vast enough to have its own gravity. I rejected it immediately. This was not knowledge I was meant to have. This was not comprehension my rank authorized. I pressed the thought down, smothering it beneath layers of doctrine and obedience. The Emperor endured by design, his suffering purposeful and perfect. To question the mechanism was to question the Omnissiah's grand design itself. I moved to the 11th station, fleeing revelation through continued duty. The walking path had narrowed to barely shoulder width, channeled between banks of machinery that hummed with purpose I could not begin to fathom. The heat was profound now, less like environment and more like immersion, as if I moved through something denser than air. My augmetic systems labored to compensate, dumping excess thermal load through heat sinks that glowed visibly in the chamber's dimness. The 11th station held cogitators of a pattern I did not recognize, their housings marked with symbols that predated the Imperium itself. They processed data at speeds my augmetics could barely register, solving equations that had no meaning to me. I was meant to verify their function, to confirm they operated within acceptable parameters. All indicators read optimal. All systems showed green, except the display showing temperature tolerance, which read red but had been overridden with a manual authorization code. The override was old, layered with centuries of renewed approval, a permanent exception to safety protocols. Someone long ago had decided these systems would always run hot, that thermal stress was acceptable and even desired. The authorization bore no signature, only a designation, throne priority override. I completed the catechism and moved forward. 12 stations total, one for each hour implied in the traditional architecture of the Sanctum Imperialis. Even though the actual duration was less than 9 hours, the symbolic structure mattered more than measured time. I was nearing completion, approaching the night's culmination. At the 12th station, I found the memory sanction altar already activated. It stood exactly where the station should have been, its presence impossible because it had not been here moments before and could not have arrived without my seeing it. The altar was small, portable, consisting of a neural interface crown suspended above a padded rest. Its authentication seals were immaculate, bearing proper Mechanicus sigils and custodian approval markers. A data slate rested beside it, displaying a form already filled with my name, rank, and assignment designation. The form was titled Voluntary Memory Sanction for Continuity Preservation. I read it without touching the slate. The language was clear, almost gentle. The sanction was not punitive. It was protective, designed to excise specific recollections that could interfere with proper function. The procedure would remove tonight's events from my accessible memory while leaving skills and general knowledge intact. I would remember that I had performed the night synchronization rite. I would not remember what I had seen, felt, or understood during its performance. The justification section cited preservation of proper mental architecture and prevention of interference patterns that could compromise future service. The recommendation came from the highest level of authority, signed by a custodian captain whose name was redacted behind clearance protocols I did not possess. My reassignment was already finalized, listed at the form's bottom. Upon completion of the sanction, I would return to regular rotation in the outer archives, performing my duties at a slightly reduced capacity, serving the Mechanicus and the Emperor until age or malfunction ended my usefulness. I had not agreed to this. I had not been consulted, yet the paperwork was perfect, authorized through channels I could not contest. The altar waited, patient and implacable, offering mercy I had not requested. Footsteps behind me. I turned and saw the custodian captain, his armor unmarked by any device I recognized. He did not speak. His presence was instruction enough. This was not negotiable. This was already decided. The night had concluded not at the 12th station but here, at this altar that existed specifically for me. I wanted to refuse. Some part of me, buried beneath layers of conditioning and augmentation, wanted to preserve what I had witnessed, to carry forward the terrible understanding that had begun forming in my awareness. But that wanting was small, and the pressure around it was vast. The custodian's presence filled the available space, leaving no room for resistance. Behind him, the other custodians had formed a semicircle, containing me not through threat but through absolute authority. The Emperor endured. The throne persisted. I was required to continue serving, and service demanded I forget what made service untenable. I approached the altar. The captain moved aside, granting access without acknowledgement. I sat where countless others must have sat before me, feeling the neural crown adjust to the contours of my skull. The interface nodes found their positions, connecting to augmetic ports I had forgotten were even capable of receiving this particular kind of instruction. The slate updated automatically, registering my physical positioning as consent. The procedure began without ceremony, without countdown or warning. Current flowed into my neural pathways, seeking out the night's formation of memory, the patterns laid down during the past hours. The sensation was not painful, it was absent, a removal of something that had existed moments before, a gentle erasure that left no wound because it took away the knowledge that wounding had occurred. I felt the 10th station disappear first. The standing position, the viewing port, the terrible understanding that had tried to form all of it folded away into blank space, leaving only the fact that I had completed the assigned task. The ninth station followed, taking with it the memory of touching the valve, of participating rather than observing. One by one, the stations unraveled backward, each moment of the night extracted with surgical precision. The custodians remained constant in my vision, unchanged and unchanging. They were the last thing I saw clearly before the procedure consumed enough memory that continuity became fragmented. I understood in my final moment of complete awareness that they had never moved because they had always been exactly here, positioned to guide personnel through this necessary conclusion. The Emperor endured, terror remained. The night had never truly begun because it was already finished, always finished, the outcome determined before the doors had sealed behind me hours or days or lifetimes ago. The sanction completed. I opened eyes that felt new, regarding the custodian captain with confusion I could not quite place. He gestured toward an exit I had not noticed before, a corridor that led back into the palace's outer regions. I stood, feeling my augmetics recalibrate to movement, and walked forward without understanding why my gait had changed slightly, why I favored my left side in ways my motion logs could not explain. Behind me, the memory sanction altar was already being prepared for the next rotation, the next night, the next person who would serve and forget they had served. The 12th station was empty again, waiting for someone to reach it and find conclusion. I walked through doors that opened ahead and sealed behind, moving through passages I recognized without remembering why. Other Mechanicus adepts nodded as I passed, offering the casual acknowledgements of shared duty. I responded appropriately, speaking words I had always known, performing social functions that required no conscious thought. My data slate held a complete record of the night's observations. I reviewed it as I walked and found everything in order. Each catechism logged, each station completed, all tasks performed with acceptable precision. The rite had been successful. The throne remained stable. The Emperor continued his eternal vigil. I had served properly and returned safely, exactly as thousands before me had returned, exactly as thousands after me would return. The archives waited, holding duties I understood and could perform without complication. I would continue my service there, maintaining records and preserving data, performing the small labors that kept the Mechanicus functioning. My faith remained intact, my devotion was unchanged. I had been honored with proximity to the Emperor himself, and though I could not recall the specific moments of that proximity, I knew with absolute certainty that I had been found acceptable and then released to lesser but necessary work. Something hurt. I could not identify what or where, only that hurt existed somewhere in my awareness, never quite visible but always present. My augmetic diagnostic systems found nothing wrong. My flesh showed no injury. The pain was correct, proper, a gift I could not remember receiving. Days passed in the archives, each one similar to the last. I performed my duties with the precision my training demanded, speaking catechisms and logging data, maintaining the endless flow of information that fed the Mechanicus's vast understanding. Other adepts asked occasionally about my night in the throne room, seeking the vicarious experience of proximity they had not yet earned. I told them it had been holy, that I had served properly, that the Emperor's presence was beyond description. These were true statements. They satisfied curiosity without conveying anything I could not remember. I dreamed sometimes, if what tech priests experienced during rest cycles could be called dreaming. In these dreams, I stood in golden light, watching needles trace patterns on parchment, while pain taught me posture and presence. The dreams felt significant, weighted with meaning I could not extract. I woke from them feeling relief and loss in equal measure, grateful for consciousness while mourning something I could not name. The archives were safe. The archives were known. I moved through them with increasing efficiency as the days became weeks, my augmetics adapting to the specific rhythms of this labor. I was where I belonged, performing duties that matched my capacity. The reassignment had been appropriate. I served the Emperor here as truly as I had served him there, in the place I could no longer visualize. Months later, during a routine data audit, I found an anomaly in my own logs. An entry from the night synchronization showed an instrument reading that should not have been possible, a deviation that had corrected itself before documentation became necessary. I stared at the notation, trying to recall the moment of observation, the specific circumstances that had produced this data. Nothing came. The memory was absent, not forgotten but removed, cleanly extracted so that even the echo of recollection had been taken. I noted the anomaly for review by higher authority and moved on to the next entry, the next task, the next moment of service. The pain persisted, gentle and instructive, teaching me nothing I could articulate. Years accumulated in the archives, each day layering over the previous until time became texture rather than progression. I served. I endured. I maintained proper function within assigned parameters. Other adepts were selected for the night synchronization, departing with anticipation and returning with the same carefully vacant expression I had worn upon my own return. We did not discuss our absences. We had nothing to discuss. The throne required witness, received it, and released us to continued service. This was the pattern. This was proper. I aged normally by Mechanicus standards, which meant slowly, with augmetics compensating for biological decline until the boundary between flesh and machine became meaningless. My efficiency never wavered. My faith remained absolute, if distant, observed from inside itself like looking through glass that grew imperceptibly thicker with each passing year. The archives held records of every night synchronization performed since the throne's installation. I had access to these records, though I rarely examined them. Once, during a maintenance cycle when I had been assigned to verify backup data integrity, I searched for entries matching my own service date. I found the logs, pristine and complete, showing that all tasks had been completed properly, all catechisms spoken, all observations recorded. At the bottom of my log entry, there was a notation I did not remember adding: continuity preserved. Subject acceptable for extended service, memory architecture corrected for optimal function. Next rotation, assignment to archives, indefinite duration. Prognosis, continued utility until cessation. The notation bore my own authentication signature. I had written it myself, during or immediately after the sanction, while enough of me remained present to document my own erasure. I closed the file and returned to my assigned duties, feeling nothing I could name. The Imperium endured. The Emperor endured. The throne persisted in its holy function, consuming what it required to maintain stability across 1,000,000 worlds. Personnel were cycled through proximity and returned to service, their witness archived and their memories corrected, generation after generation maintaining continuity through selective forgetting. I had been part of this system. I was still part of this system. I would remain part until age or accident removed me, at which point another would take my position, performing the same tasks, maintaining the same records, existing in the same state of functional service. The pain never left. It refined itself over years until I could no longer distinguish it from normal sensation. It had become part of my baseline experience, teaching me constantly without instruction, correcting posture and thought through mechanisms I could not identify. I walked differently because of it. I held my hands at specific angles without knowing why. I stood in certain positions and felt momentary relief from an ache that had no source. The Emperor had touched me. I could not remember the touching, but my body remembered, carrying forward the shape of his attention in tissue and nerve. I was marked by proximity I could not recall, changed by witness I could not describe, serving because service was the only function that remained after everything else had been gently taken. On my 70th year of service in the archives, a new archivist second class arrived for training. She was young, recently graduated from the Schola, her augmetics fresh enough that she still flinched when they activated. I taught her the proper procedures for data maintenance, the correct catechisms for machine spirit appeasement, the thousands of small protocols that allowed the archives to function. She asked me once if I had ever served in the Sanctum Imperialis itself. I told her I had performed the night synchronization decades ago. Her eyes widened with religious awe, and she asked what it had been like, whether I had felt the Emperor's presence, whether the experience had changed me. I answered that it had been proper, that all procedures had been followed, that the Emperor's presence was beyond my ability to describe. She looked disappointed, having hoped for something more dramatic, some revelation that would make the glory tangible. I felt momentarily sad for her, understanding that if she earned the rotation to the throne room, she would return with the same absence I carried, the same hole where understanding should have been. She would serve properly. She would forget correctly. She would continue in diminished capacity, never knowing what she had lost because the loss itself had been part of what was taken. I completed her training and returned to my own duties, maintaining records that documented everything and explained nothing. The archives grew as all archives do, accumulating data faster than any human or machine could process. We preserved it anyway, trusting that someone, someday, in some future age, might have the time and comprehension to extract meaning from these endless recordings. We were custodians of incomprehensible data, maintaining what we could not understand because maintenance itself was holy. I worked until my augmetics required replacement, then worked through the replacement procedures, then worked until the replacements needed replacement. Flesh failed. Metal persisted. Faith endured without requiring belief. On a day that felt like all the others, I received notification that I had been selected for reassignment. My service in the archives had been exemplary and prolonged. I was being transferred to a lesser administrative position, acknowledging that age and accumulated wear had reduced my functional efficiency. The reassignment was framed as honor, recognition of long service, but I understood it as what it was, the beginning of my fade into obsolescence. I reported to the new position and found it exactly as described: small duties, minimal responsibility, tasks designed to keep aging personnel useful without requiring excellence. I performed adequately. My presence was sufficient. I continued. Years blurred together. I stopped counting them. My chronometer tracked days, but days became texture, indistinguishable from each other except through variation too subtle to matter. I was old by any standard, ancient by some, preserved far beyond normal human span through augmetics and duty. I served because I had always served. I continued because cessation had not been authorized. The pain remained constant, my oldest companion, more reliable than memory or faith. It taught me nothing new. It simply persisted, proof that something had happened to me once, that I had stood somewhere important and been changed in ways I could not articulate. On the day my primary cardiac augmetic failed, I felt something shift in the pain's quality. It became urgent, almost communicative, as if trying to convey information before the channel closed permanently. I lay in the Medicae facility, surrounded by tech priests who worked to stabilize my failing systems, and felt the pain resolve into something almost like words. You stood in his presence. You witnessed his suffering. You carried forward knowledge of his endurance. The catechism from the 10th station, rising from tissue and nerve, preserved in the body when it could not be preserved in mind. I had spoken those words while standing before the throne, and my flesh had remembered even as my consciousness forgot. The understanding came fully formed. I had seen something true. I had been changed by it. The change had been too dangerous to remember consciously, but too important to completely erase. So it had been written into pain, into the way I moved and stood and held myself. Encoded in physical existence because cognitive existence could not safely hold it. I had served. I had witnessed. I had been sanctified through proximity and diminished to survive that sanctification. The system had worked perfectly, preserving my usefulness while protecting me from knowledge that would have made continued service impossible. The tech priests stabilized my cardiac function. I survived. I returned to limited duty, carrying with me the brief understanding that had emerged during crisis. The understanding faded quickly, subsumed back into pain and habit. But for a moment I had known why I served, what I had lost, what I had been permitted to keep. It was enough. It had to be enough. The Emperor endured. I endured. Between those two facts, everything else was detail. I served through my final decades in the diminished capacity appropriate to my age and condition. My augmetics failed incrementally, each system reaching tolerance limits and declining despite maintenance. My flesh persisted through stubbornness and conditioning, unwilling to cease until cessation was properly authorized. Authorization came on a day that felt no different than any other. A Mechanicus adept arrived with the appropriate documentation, informing me that my service had been evaluated and found complete. I was released to final rest with gratitude for dedication and acknowledgement that all duties had been properly fulfilled. The paperwork was perfect. The process was gentle. I was escorted to a retirement facility within the palace precincts, a quiet place where aged servants of the Imperium could fade in dignity and comfort. The room they assigned me held a bed, a chair, a window that looked toward the Sanctum Imperialis, though from too far away to see any detail. I sat in the chair and watched the direction I could no longer remember walking, feeling pain that had become so familiar it was identical to absence. The end came slowly, then quickly. Systems failed in cascade, each one triggering the next, the machine components of my existence shutting down according to protocols beyond my control. I lay in the bed and felt myself diminishing, consciousness narrowing, the boundaries of self becoming negotiable. In the final moments, the pain returned to perfect clarity, sharp and instructive one last time. It guided my attention inward, toward a memory that could not be remembered, toward witness that had been taken but never truly erased. I had stood in the throne room. I had seen the Emperor's suffering. I had understood something too vast for my rank or my mind, and I had been changed by it. The change persisted. It persisted in pain and posture, in habit and hurt, in the way I had carried myself through decades of service after the conscious memory had been excised. I had borne witness even after forgetting what I witnessed. I had continued serving what I could no longer remember seeing. The Emperor endured through those who could not endure remembering. The throne persisted through personnel who could not persist unchanged. The system functioned by consuming understanding while preserving function. I had been consumed properly. I had been preserved appropriately. My service had been acceptable. It was enough. My final thought was the catechism from the 10th station, rising one last time from tissue that could no longer contain it. I stood in your presence. I witnessed your suffering. I carry forward knowledge of your endurance. Then the thought ceased, and the pain ceased, and the carrying forward ceased.